In the early hours of February 28, 2026, American Tomahawk missiles and Israeli precision munitions tore through the heart of Tehran. Operation Epic Fury was not a warning or a limited strike. It was a calculated campaign to bring down the Islamic Republic from the top. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, 86 years old, in power for over 3 decades, was dead by morning. Command centers, missile factories, air defense batteries, military airfields, and the remnants of Iran's nuclear program were struck simultaneously across the entire country. Iran fought back with everything it had. Operation True Promise 4 sent hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones at American bases across the Gulf, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE. 3 U.S. service members were killed when an Iranian drone struck Camp Boring in Kuwait, the first Americans to die in direct combat with Iran. But while the missiles were flying and Tehran was burning, something extraordinary was happening. Or rather, something extraordinary was not happening. Russia, which had signed a sweeping 20-year strategic partnership with Iran just 13 months earlier, issued a statement of diplomatic condemnation. And nothing else. China, which had been purchasing over 90% of Iran's oil exports and pledged hundreds of billions in investment, called for an immediate ceasefire and went silent. 2 of the most powerful countries on Earth, countries that had spent years cultivating deep military, economic, and political ties with Tehran, watched their partner get dismantled in real time and did absolutely nothing to stop it. This is the story of why. To understand this betrayal, you have to understand what these relationships actually were and what they were never meant to be. Russia's connection to Iran traces back to the Cold War and accelerated after the 1979 Islamic Revolution stripped Tehran of its Western alliances overnight. Suddenly isolated and desperate for partners, Iran turned east. Moscow was happy to help, selling weapons, technology, and eventually the sophisticated S-300 air defense systems that became Iran's primary shield. But from the very beginning, this was a transactional arrangement, never a genuine alliance, never a commitment to stand together when things got hard. China's relationship with Iran followed the same logic, rooted not in ideology or shared values, but in Beijing's hunger for cheap energy. In March 2021, the 2 countries announced a landmark 25-year cooperation agreement. China would invest up to $400 billion in Iran in exchange for heavily discounted oil. Tehran celebrated it as proof that the East was rising and that Iran had finally found the great power backing it had long been denied by the West. The reality was far less impressive. Over the previous 15 years, China had actually invested roughly $27 billion in Iran, a fraction of what the deal implied. Meanwhile, Iranian markets were flooded with cheap Chinese consumer goods that undercut and destroyed local industries. Iran's economy was becoming structurally dependent on a single buyer who could dictate terms at will. To many ordinary Iranians, the partnership looked less like mutual benefit and more like economic colonization dressed up in diplomatic language. The relationship deepened further after Russia's full invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, but for reasons that would later prove fatal to Iran's assumptions. Putin needed drones. Iran's Shahid suicide drones had become a devastatingly effective and cheap weapon, capable of overwhelming air defenses and terrorizing civilian populations. In exchange for them, Russia began delivering Su-35 fighter jets, attack helicopters, combat trainers, and modern air defense systems to Tehran. In January 2025, Putin and Iranian President Pezeshkian sat together in the Kremlin and signed the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership Treaty, a document covering defense, counterterrorism, energy, and finance. Russian military analysts stated publicly that the treaty committed Moscow to supply Iran with weapons for self-defense and to refuse any assistance to those who attacked the Islamic Republic. On paper, Iran had finally secured what it had been chasing for decades: formal backing from a nuclear-armed permanent member of the UN Security Council. Western analysts noticed something immediately. The treaty contained no mutual defense clause, no binding obligation for Russia to actually defend Iran if it were attacked. The security language was nearly identical to a treaty signed between the same two countries back in 2001. In 24 years of partnership, nothing fundamental had changed. The first major crack appeared in late 2024, and it should have been impossible to miss. Bashar al-Assad, Russia's oldest and most deeply invested Middle Eastern ally, was toppled in a matter of days by rebel forces. For 9 years, Putin had deployed his air force, his navy, and Wagner mercenaries to keep Assad in power. He had used Syria as the centerpiece of his argument that Russia, unlike America, never abandoned its friends. Then, in November 2024, Turkish-backed rebels launched their offensive. Russia, overstretched and exhausted by nearly 3 years of grinding war in Ukraine, simply couldn't respond. Iranian lawmakers later alleged that Russian aircraft dropped bombs on empty fields rather than rebel positions, and that Moscow had switched off its radar systems while Israeli strikes hit Iranian military assets inside Syria. Turkey's own foreign minister confirmed that Russia had the capability to act and chose not to. Assad fled to Moscow in defeat, and with him went Iran's land corridor for supplying Hezbollah in Lebanon, a devastating strategic loss that exposed the entire so-called axis of resistance as far more fragile than anyone in Tehran wanted to admit. The message could not have been clearer. When it costs too much, Russia walks away. Then came the protests. On December 28, 2025, shopkeepers in Tehran's Grand Bazaar shuttered their doors to protest the collapse of the Iranian rial, runaway inflation, and years of economic mismanagement. Within days, demonstrations had spread to all 31 provinces and evolved into the most serious challenge to the Islamic Republic since the revolution itself. The regime's response was catastrophic. Security forces fired live ammunition into unarmed crowds. Snipers were positioned on rooftops, shooting protesters in the head and torso as families tried to flee through city streets. Human rights organizations documented thousands of deaths in the first 48 hours alone. With morgues overflowing, the government imposed a near-total internet blackout to prevent the world from witnessing the scale of what was happening. And where were Russia and China during all of this? Russia, which had provided Iran with surveillance technology, communication interception systems, and training for suppressing domestic unrest since at least 2010, said nothing publicly. Analysts noted that the internet shutdown and GPS jamming bore the hallmarks of Russian electronic warfare doctrine, suggesting Moscow had helped build the very infrastructure now being used to crush Iran's own citizens. China issued no statement about the massacres. Its 25-year cooperation deal had included cybersecurity provisions, and Beijing had helped construct the digital systems used to monitor and control dissent. Neither country condemned the killings, called for restraint, or used their substantial leverage with Tehran to stop the bloodshed. The bitter irony, it was the United States, the country Iran's government had spent 47 years defining itself in opposition to, that applied the only outside pressure the regime actually feared. When Operation Epic Fury began on February 28, the world watched to see whether the partnerships Iran had built over decades would hold under pressure. They did not. Russia's foreign ministry moved quickly, not to assist Iran, but to issue a carefully constructed statement condemning the strikes as unprovoked aggression while pointing the finger entirely at Washington and Tel Aviv. Foreign Minister Lavrov called his Iranian counterpart, offered condolences, expressed readiness to help broker peace, and warned of a potential radiological catastrophe. Strong language. No action. Zero military support. Zero intelligence sharing. Zero material assistance as American and Israeli strikes dismantled the country Russia had called its strategic partner. The explanation for Moscow's paralysis was straightforward, even if it was brutal. Russia's military had been ground down by nearly 4 years of war in Ukraine, with no capacity to project force beyond its own immediate borders. More critically, Putin was actively courting Donald Trump for a favorable settlement in Ukraine and antagonizing the American president by defending Iran militarily would have destroyed those negotiations instantly. Moscow had already extracted what it needed most from the partnership. Iran's drone technology had been replicated in domestic Russian factories. Tehran's most valuable contribution to the relationship had already been absorbed. Iran was now strategically expendable. Some Russian analysts even identified a silver lining. With Iranian oil exports disrupted, Russia could step in and capture a larger share of the Chinese energy market. Moscow would mourn Iran in its press releases and quietly calculate how to benefit from the aftermath. China's response was calibrated with even greater precision. A foreign ministry spokesperson expressed concern, called for Iran's sovereignty to be respected, and urged all parties to stop fighting. The diplomatic equivalent of a form letter. Beijing had already quietly warned its citizens inside Iran to leave the country in the hours before the strikes, suggesting Chinese intelligence knew what was coming and chose to protect its own people rather than alert its supposed partner. The reason for China's restraint was, again, straightforward. Beijing had a Trump visit to China in the works, active trade negotiations with Washington, and no appetite for jeopardizing the economic relationship with America over a partner it had already started treating as a declining asset. A weakened Iran would actually become more dependent on China, not less, giving Beijing even greater leverage over Tehran's economy and foreign policy at minimal cost. China had reportedly been negotiating to sell Iran advanced supersonic anti-ship missiles and was working to replace Western software in Iranian systems. But none of it arrived in time. And some analysts at the American Enterprise Institute argued that Beijing's arms transfers had actually helped accelerate the American decision to strike, that the prospect of Iran acquiring Chinese carrier-killer missiles had narrowed the window for diplomacy and hardened the case for military action. China's attempt to strengthen Iran may have inadvertently triggered the attack that destroyed it. There is a pattern here that runs through Syria, through the protest massacres, through Operation Epic Fury. And each time, the same cold lesson repeats itself. Russia chose its war in Ukraine over Iran because Ukraine represents an existential strategic priority. Iran was a useful partner while the costs were low, and an expendable one the moment they weren't. China chose its economic relationship with America over its strategic partnership with Iran because no volume of discounted crude oil was worth risking the trade flows that sustain the Chinese economy and keep the Communist Party in power. The so-called multipolar world order that Russia and China have championed for years, built on BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and bilateral strategic partnerships presented as an alternative to American hegemony, collapsed at the moment it was actually tested. When the United States struck with overwhelming force alongside Israel, no multipolar coalition rose to counter it. No collective security mechanism activated. The UN Security Council was paralyzed, and the bombs kept falling because no nation on earth was willing to physically stand between America and its objective. This is not an accident. It is the fundamental reality of global power in the 21st century, stripped of diplomatic pretense and exposed in the harsh light of actual war. American defense spending exceeds the next 10 nations combined. Its carrier strike groups can project force anywhere on Earth within days. When Washington decides to act, words alone cannot stop it, and both Moscow and Beijing understood that clearly enough to stay out of the way. The 2025 strikes had already demonstrated this. American B-2 bombers attacked 3 Iranian nuclear facilities from altitudes beyond the range of the very Russian air defense systems Tehran had spent billions acquiring. The Su-35 jets Moscow delivered proved ineffective against fifth-generation American stealth aircraft. Iran had invested its scarce resources in Russian and Chinese military hardware only to discover in combat that these weapons could not protect it from the adversary it actually faced, and that its suppliers had no intention of closing that gap. NATO, for all its internal disputes and burden-sharing arguments, has Article 5, a mutual defense clause that has been invoked in real combat and is backed by actual military force. The partnerships Russia and China offer carry no such guarantees, no binding obligations, and as Iran discovered on February 28th, no protection when it matters most. Inside Iran, this reality was not lost on ordinary people. Anti-regime protesters had already begun calling Khamenei not a sovereign defender of national interests, but a puppet of Beijing and Moscow who had sold the country's future for weapons that didn't work and investments that never materialized. In the streets of Tehran, where protesters had faced live ammunition just weeks before the American strikes, the Eastern Alliance was not seen as Iran's salvation. It was seen as its curse. The geopolitical aftershock of this abandonment is now reverberating through every capital that has placed its security in Russian or Chinese hands. North Korea, Venezuela, the military juntas of Africa's Sahel, all of them are watching what happened to Iran and quietly recalculating. If Russia would not fight for Syria, could not sustain its own war in Ukraine, and abandoned a treaty partner under direct military attack, what exactly is a Russian security guarantee worth? If China would not provide even meaningful diplomatic cover for a country supplying 14% of its imported oil, what partner could reasonably expect Beijing to accept real costs on their behalf? The answers are rewriting the international order in real time. Iran's tragedy was believing that multipolar rhetoric would translate into multipolar protection, that signing treaties with great powers meant those powers would actually fight for you when the moment arrived. On February 28, 2026, that belief was destroyed alongside the compound of its supreme leader. In the end, there are no permanent friends in geopolitics, only permanent interests. And when those interests diverge, even the most labor-rate treaties become nothing more than ink on paper, which, it turns out, burns just as easily as everything else.